what happened at the end of the 20th century was, for the first time in human history, people were having children who had sometimes never even seen a child, let alone, or seen a child in the distance, but certainly had never taken care of a child over an extended period themselves. And this has become more intense when I teach my introductory class at Berkeley. I always ask my students, how many of you here have actually cared for a child? And it's amazingly few in a room full of young people. Now, on the other hand, those same parents who now were having children at a much older age with less general extended family support had spent many years going to school and working. And so it was very natural for them to think that this process of having a child was another job, another thing that you could get a manual for, or another thing where if you just went through the training session, then you would be able to figure out how to do this effectively. And this model of thinking about taking care of children as if it was another kind of goal-directed work with benchmarks and outcomes and ways that you could measure success naturally became a very prevalent model in that circumstance. I want to start out talking about a funny thing that happened to parents and children around the end of the 20th century. And it was called parenting. Now, if you look at the Google Ngram for that word, parenting, you'll see that it first really started to appear in the 1960s, and it became enormously popular through the 1970s and 80s. Now, a word is just a word, but it's still pretty striking that that very word parenting, which is so ubiquitous now, was actually an invention of the late 20th century. And that word comes with a picture. It comes with a kind of image of what relations between parents and children are supposed to be like. After all, the words mother and father are as old as English itself, and the idea of being a parent is an ancient part of English. What's the difference between that and this new verb of parenting? Well, the picture of parenting was that parenting was a kind of work. It was a goal-directed activity that you could do, where the goal was actually shaping a child to come out differently, to come out smarter, or to come out better, or to come out more successful. Now, exactly better than what, or more successful than what, or happier than what isn't always clear, although I do think the thing that we whisper underneath our breath is, then that other kid next door who doesn't have a parent who's as good at parenting as I am. And the idea was that if you just shaped this child the right way, then you could in turn have that child turn into a better adult, a better grown-up. And I think there were some reasons why this particular picture, now so ubiquitous, of parenting emerged at the end of the 20th century. And I'll refer to some of this later on, but for most of human history, the way that we learned how to take care of children was by having taken care of children. So for most of human history, children were growing up in a big extended family with lots of siblings, with lots of cousins, grandparents taking care of them, something I'll return to. But one thing that meant was that you yourself were taking care of your younger sibs, taking care of your younger cousins, watching lots of different people take care of children all the time that you were a child yourself. So by the time you actually had your own children, you had an enormous stock of expertise and knowledge and a sense of what this process of caregiving was about. And what happened at the end of the 20th century was, for the first time in human history, people were having children who had sometimes never even seen a child, let alone, or seen a child in the distance, but certainly had never taken care of a child over an extended period themselves. And this has become more intense when I teach my introductory class at Berkeley. I always ask my students, how many of you here have actually cared for a child? And it's amazingly few in a room full of young people. Now, on the other hand, those same parents who now were having children at a much older age with less general extended family support had spent many years going to school and working. And so it was very natural for them to think that this process of having a child was another job, another thing that you could get a manual for, or another thing where if you just went through the training session, then you would be able to figure out how to do this effectively. And this model of thinking about taking care of children as if it was another kind of goal-directed work with benchmarks and outcomes and ways that you could measure success naturally became a very prevalent model in that circumstance. Now, the genesis for this book was that I started out wanting to write a book that was about these really exciting developments in our understanding of children and childhood and parents that have happened really just over the past 15 or 20 years. Developments in evolutionary biology and developments in the kind of developmental psychology in the lab that I do. But one of the things that happened was at the same time I became a grandmother very happily, and that kind of plunged me back into the world of caregiving. And I was struck by the fact that this model of parenting, of relations between parents and children that had become so pervasive was exactly the opposite of the model that was coming out of the science. So at the same time that the science was telling us more and more about how children learn, and specifically how children learn from parents, the picture in the world at large, the picture of this billion-dollar parenting industry, the picture that had become so ubiquitous was exactly the opposite of that model. And that's really the point about the book. So the point of the book is to contrast this parenting picture to the picture that comes out of the science. And one way of trying to get a metaphor that captures that difference is this metaphor of the carpenter versus the gardener. So the parenting model sees the process of being a parent as being very much like being a carpenter. If you're a carpenter, you have some respect for the materials that you have, but you still have the picture that there's some set of techniques that you can undergo, and if you just control the process enough and you're expert enough, you will be able to get a predictable kind of chair at the end of the process. And that's kind of what the parenting picture is like. If you just do the right things, you'll have a good child, and that good child will turn into a good adult. The picture that comes from evolution, a very different picture, is more like the picture of being a gardener. Now, in practice, I think I had this metaphor partly because I am myself a gardener, and if you're actually a practical gardener, you know that in spite of the fact that you work incredibly hard and sweat and toil and you're up to your ears in manure a lot of the time, nothing in the garden comes out the way that you expect or the way that you planned or the way you wanted to begin with. Unfortunately, that's true about the marvelous things that happen in the garden that you didn't plan and didn't expect, as well as the assorted disasters that happen in the garden that you didn't plan and didn't expect. But there's actually a deep reason for that. That's not just the luck of being a gardener. And the deep reason is that when you garden, what you're trying to do is create an ecosystem. You're trying to put all that work into creating fertile soil in a protected space that will allow a diverse, resilient, changeable kind of ecosystem to develop. And one of the other things, of course, that we've discovered over the last 30 years or so is that that kind of diverse, unpredictable, changeable ecosystem is a much better kind of system, a much better kind of garden, a much better kind of agriculture, for example, than a system where you're simply trying to create one kind of organism and make it as large or as successful or as healthy as you possibly could. So what we do when we garden is not to create any one particular plant, it's to create a community of diverse, unpredictable plants that can react to the changes in the weather or the changes in the season in novel ways. That's really the whole point of gardening. And what I'm going to argue is that the whole point of childhood and the whole point of being a parent is to create a similar kind of human ecosystem. It's to create novelty, variability, unexpectedness, a system that's resilient and dynamic and responds to the changes around it. And that's a very different picture from the kind of carpentry parenting picture of creating a child who's going to be the very best child of all the children on the block. So let me talk a little bit more about the evolutionary background of childhood. One of the really striking and apparently paradoxical things about human beings is that we have this incredibly long childhood. We have a much longer childhood than any other creature. So if you look at our closest primate relatives, like the chimpanzee, chimpanzees are actually producing as much food as they're consuming by the time they're 7 years old. And even among hunter-gatherers, or foragers as we now call them, incidentally, people kind of recognize the word hunter-gatherer rather than foragers, but anthropologists have started calling these communities foragers because it turns out that the hunting doesn't actually do very much. The hunters aren't actually contributing as much as we might have thought in the past, and there's actually a bit of a puzzle about why there's such a big deal about the hunting, given that most of the calories are coming from the grandmoms who are out digging tubers in the back 40. My own personal theory, which other grandmothers like me have confirmed, is it's basically so that the guys won't be there telling you how to grow the tubers all the time. I have this vision of the Pleistocene, some Pleistocene grandmother who had the brilliant idea of saying, you know, honey, a steak would be really nice. We'd really like to have some meat would be great. Why don't you just go out and hunt a mastodon and leave me here to take care of the kids and dig out the tubers? That's a myth, obviously. In any case, even in forager societies, children aren't producing as much food as they're consuming until they're 15. And in our present-day culture, my son, who is here in the audience, is 28, and we're still sort of writing tuition checks when they're 28. Why would that be? That seems tremendously paradoxical from an evolutionary perspective. Why put so much time and energy and work into just keeping these children alive? The explanation, if you look across a wide variety of different kinds of species, is that there's actually a remarkable correlation between the length of this period of immaturity, the length of childhood, and how smart and flexible and large-brained the adult animals are. And the kind of poster animals for this relationship are not even mammals, but birds. So if you look among birds, for example, I've actually collaborated with people studying New Caledonian crows. And crows and corvids and ravens in general are amazingly intelligent birds, as I think all bird fanciers know. These New Caledonian crows are unbelievably intelligent. They're smarter than chimpanzees are. They can do something like take a little piece of wire in the lab and turn it into a hook, a tool that they can use to open up a tube and get food. On the other hand, our friend the domestic chicken is basically as dumb as a stump. Or maybe that's not fair. The domestic chicken is incredibly well adapted to peck for grain and does all sorts of high-powered computations in their brain that are all about grain pecking. What they're not very good at is learning how to do something new. So whereas you can take a New Caledonian crow, plunk it in a lab in Cambridge, give it a wire, and it'll figure out what to do with it, the chickens basically start out being good at pecking grain when they're born. In fact, you can show that newborn chickens already are extremely good at doing these kinds of things, and they pretty much stay that way throughout their lives. And that's true about ducks and turkeys and all our birds in this family. And the chickens are mature within weeks or months. The crows in general are fledglings for as long as a year. The New Caledonian crows are fledglings for 2 years, which is a really long time in the life of a bird. And that relationship holds across the animal kingdom. It's true of birds, it's true of placental mammals, it's true of marsupials. Just everywhere you look, you see this relationship. Why would that be? Why would there be this relationship between having a very long period of immaturity, a very long helpless childhood, and being a very smart, to be perhaps a little anthropocentric about it, a very smart adult animal, or at least an adult animal very good at learning? The thought is that some animals, like the chicken, are beautifully adapted to one particular evolutionary niche. Other animals, like us, are not very well adapted to any particular evolutionary niche, but we're very good at adapting to changing circumstances. We're very good at changing our behavior to suit a new environment. We're very good at learning. Now, that strategy has one big drawback, and that big drawback is that during that period when you're learning, you're going to be helpless. So you don't want to actually have a mastodon be charging at you and be saying to yourself, a mastodon, how shall I deal with this situation? Maybe a stick would work, or, I could try inventing slingshot, that's not going to be a very effective strategy. And the way that evolution seems to have resolved this is by giving us a long period early, a childhood, in which what we can do is just learn, just figure out what our environment is actually like, and then we can take all those things that we learned when we were a child and actually put them to use as an adult to do all the things that we need to do as adults. You could think about children as being the research and development division of the human species, and we adults are production and marketing. So they're the blue sky guys, they get to just think about new ideas, and we actually have to put things into practice. In fact, if you look at these New Caledonian crows and see what it is that they're doing in that 2 years when they're helpless fledglings, it's actually quite informative. So in the wild, these animals do this amazing thing. They take pandanus palm leaves, they strip off the bottom leaves, leaving little barbs. Then they nibble the end of the leaf to the stem to a sharp point. Then they take it in their beaks with the thick end. Then they find a hole that has termites in it. Then they take this tool and stir up the termites, and then they pull out a termite shish kebab, basically, that they've made with this pandanus palm leaf. And this isn't something that they're born doing, it's something that they have learned to do in this particular environment. Well, when you watch the young crows for those 2 years, what are they doing? They're screwing this up. So basically what they're doing is doing the barbs at the top instead of the bottom, and trying to hold it from the thin end instead of the big end, and generally failing to get termites. And the mums and dads are sort of sitting there tapping their feet and dropping termites into the babies, into the helpless teenagers' mouths. But of course, one of the things that we all know, one of the slogans that we have in Silicon Valley, near where I am in Berkeley, is fail faster and fail better, and that's the way to innovate. So the way to innovate, the way to get new ideas, the way to learn, is try things over and over again and fail most of the time and keep trying afterwards. So what childhood seems to be about is giving you a time to try things that are new and unprecedented, and giving you a time to fail, but fail without immediate consequences because you're being taken care of by caregivers. And in fact, as you might expect, what we see is that evolutionary adaptation of a long childhood and a big brain and a lot of learning goes with more parental investment. So again, if you look at some of my favorite animals, the quokka, for example, in Australia, a little placental, incredibly adorable marsupial. The quokka actually has not just the mother, but the father and other members of the community all are involved in taking care of these babies who stay in the mother's pouch for about a year. If you contrast that with an otherwise very similar marsupial, the opossum has 7 or 8 babies at a time. The babies are mature within a few months. Nobody takes care of the babies except the mother. So there's a kind of obvious relationship between this investment and this period of immaturity. And the quokka's brains are twice as big as the possum's brains. People who know about such things confirm that possums are about as dumb an animal, certainly as dumb a marsupial as you could have. And if you think about the human evolutionary niche, we're way out on the end of the distribution on all of these measures. So as I said before, we have a much longer childhood than any other species. We have much larger brains. We exist in a wider range of different environments. We're much better at learning than any other species. And we have more parental investment than any other species. We have what I think of as the parental investment triple threat. If you compare us to our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, for example, essentially among chimpanzees, biological mothers are doing almost all of the caregiving until the babies are sufficiently independent to take care of themselves. If you look even in forager societies, for as long as we've been human, we've had pair bonding. So we've had fathers who are actually attached to mothers and are involved in taking care of babies. We kind of take that for granted, but in fact only 5% of mammals show this pair bonding pattern. So it's actually, and our closest primate relatives, none of our closest primate relatives do. It's actually quite unusual. So having mothers and fathers who love each other and take care of babies together, that's a really distinctive human adaptation. We have what the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy calls allomothers, which means that people who aren't biological kin of children are nevertheless involved in caring for children. And again, that distinguishes us from our closest relatives. A recent study of forager culture found that on average, babies in this culture were breastfed by 4 different women in the community in the course of a week. So the idea that everybody, the proverbial taking a village, really seems to have been true for us as long as we were human. And not only that, but it was one of the things that made us human. It was one of the things that distinguished us from our closest primate relatives. And we have my personal favorite, the grandmother. So we're the only primate species where women actually outlive their fertility. And it turns out that we always have. If you look in forager cultures, women are living until their 60s or 70s. And if you look among chimps, even when they're very well taken care of, their female chimps aren't living past about age 50. They're not outliving their fertility. Again, from an evolutionary point of view, this seems paradoxical. Why am I, and I assume looking around many of the people in this audience, still here? It turns out that actually that grandmotherly and to some extent grandfatherly investment is the thing that enables our babies to continue. So, for example, if you look at the survival of toddlers, 2-year-olds, that actually turns out to depend more on the resources that the grandmother has than on the resources that the mother has. So the grandmothers are providing this essential piece of caregiving, which enables us to have this extremely long period of childhood and to have many children with this long period of childhood. Okay, if this evolutionary picture that I'm talking about is right, you might expect to see it reflected in our brains and in our brain development. And in fact, you do. So if you look at brain development, one of the things that you see is there's this striking difference between an early period in human brains, where our brains are, as neuroscientists say, incredibly plastic, very flexible. We're making many, many, many new synapses, new brain connections every minute. So that's kind of what the young brain looks like. But that brain is also very inefficient. There aren't very fast, efficient connections between one part of the brain and another. And around age 5, although at different ages in different parts of the brain, there's this real shift when the neural connections that have been made get stronger and stronger and more efficient, and the ones that haven't been made, that haven't been used, just disappear. There's a process called pruning where those unused connections just go away. So you really, even when you look at the neuroscience, you see this young brain very well designed for learning, very well designed for exploring, very well designed for doing things that are new, and an old brain that's a lean, mean machine, very good at making things happen, very good at doing things, not so good at learning things that are new. You even see this when you look at the amount of energy that our brains use. This is my favorite new fact. This just came out in PNAS and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about a year ago. As you may know, as you're sitting here right now, your brain is using up 20% of your calories. So brains, like other computing gadgets, are energy beasts. They're really, really hungry. It always seems to me that, if you were thinking really, really good, deep thoughts like a good scientist, you should be using up more calories, but unfortunately it turns out it doesn't really matter. Just as long as you're, a conscious human, you're using up about 20% of your calories. What they did recently was look at this over time. It turns out that when you're 4-year-olds are using 66% of their calories for their brains. So almost all the food that they have is going to power these incredibly powerful, active brains. So I kind of like this vision. My adorable 4-year-old grandson, Augie, is really like this creature out of Doctor Who with this he's basically this enormous hungry brain attached to this little body that casts spells on all the rest of us and makes us into his slaves, which is a pretty good description. So that's yet another clue about what that long period is about, that hungry period early on when we're basically going around feeding our 4-year-olds' brains. That's what our role as caregivers is all about. And we know something about the We know something even about the triggers for that kind of evolution of an extended childhood. So rather fascinatingly, it turns out that the ecological change that led to human evolution was not that the climate got warmer or got colder, it was that it got unpredictable. So the climate became much more variable. You couldn't tell what was going to happen from one season or one generation to the next. And in addition to that, we were nomadic from the time we were human, in contrast to our closest primate relatives. So we were always going to new environments. And of course, we have culture, which means that we could create new environments. So we are the creature that's adapted to the unknown unknowns. The unknown unknowns are our evolutionary niche. We created climate change, but climate change created us too. Now, if you think about, okay, so let's go back to thinking about the parenting picture in the light of this kind of evolutionary evidence. What the evolutionary evidence suggests is that children are designed for learning. That's what children are all about. And particularly, children are designed for variability and novelty. They're designed to be the people who, when they get plunked in a new environment, unlike any that human beings have ever faced before, are able to figure out a new way of coping with that environment. And the role that the caregivers have, this absolutely essential, distinctively human role, is not shaping the children to come out a particular way. It's giving the children, the way that we do in a garden, a protected space in which they can discover these new things, understand new things, create new things in the world around them. So from this perspective, even if we could accomplish the parenting end of shaping our children to come out a particular way, we would have defeated the whole point of childhood by doing that. Because the whole point of childhood is not to simply replicate what the previous generation did, not simply even to do what the previous generation thinks is important, it's to create things that are new. Now, the second part of the book is about some of the ways that children are, and this is where my own research comes in, some of the ways that children learn that reflect this incredible capacity for novelty, for exploration, for possibility, for innovation. And over the past 30 years or so, in the same kind of period when this evolutionary work has happened, we've discovered that even the very youngest children already know more and especially learn more than we ever would have thought before. And they have learning mechanisms in place that are as powerful as the learning mechanisms of the very smartest scientists. So, for example, we can show children a little machine that works in a particular way. We can show them, we call it our Blicket detector. We show them blocks that go on top of the machine. And when we give children this kind of problem in a real concrete way like this, the children can use elaborate statistical inferences to figure out from the pattern of events that they see how the machine actually works, why one thing is a Blicket and not another, or how you actually would make the machine work yourself. And in experiments we've been doing in my lab, in collaboration with computer scientists, we found that children in this kind of context can solve problems that stump the very best machine learning algorithms that we have. They're incredibly powerful learners. Now, here's the important thing. The way they learn in these experiments is just by looking. It's just by observing what's going on around them. It's not by having someone shape them or teach them. It's just by watching what the people around them do. And in some of these experiments, we've shown that very often children are actually better at learning something new than adults are. So, for instance, if we show the children one of these machines that works in an unusual way, a way that you wouldn't expect on the surface, we give exactly the same problem to our 4-year-olds and our Berkeley undergraduates. The 4-year-olds will figure out the new way that the machine works. The Berkeley undergraduates will just stick to the thing that they already knew. Now, that may be because undergraduates tend to just want to know whether something is going to be on the test or not, but when we test with adults in general, the adults are relying on the things that they already know. The 4-year-olds are figuring out something new, something that's unprecedented, that's not like the things that the adults know. And in fact, there's even evidence that I talk about in the book which suggests that the kind of teaching and pedagogy which goes with the parenting picture. The parenting picture is very parasitic on the kind of schooling picture that says that's what we do with children in school as well. We do the right things and we'll shape them to have particular kinds of knowledge or come out in the right way. that can actually backfire, that can actually limit this kind of natural exploration of possibility that we see in children. So, for example, in experiments in my lab, we've looked at the way that children imitate what somebody else does. So, for example, we can show the children a complicated toy that plays music. The experimenter does a series of actions on the toy, like she pulls a ring and she turns it over and she squeezes a bulb, and she does 10 different sequences of these 3 actions. Well, if you were a smart computer or a good statistician, when you looked at those 10 different sequences, you would figure out that actually only 2 of the actions was necessary to make the machine go. The others were just sort of superfluous. And it turns out, amazingly, that 4-year-olds will do the same thing. So if you now hand the toy to the 4-year-old, they'll just do the 2 things that are necessary to make the machine go. They'll ignore the unnecessary, superfluous things that the experimenter did. But if the experimenter says, this is my toy, I'm going to show you how it works, then all the children do is imitate exactly what it was that she had done before. In fact, I could... if you look at the graph, there's a 0. They never get to the intelligent, creative, novel solution. And by now, I talk about this in the book, there's an enormous, really fascinating literature about just how sophisticated children's imitation is. So children are learning by observing just the everyday things that the people around them do, but they're not doing it in a simple, mindless way at all. They're actually very sensitive to even very subtle things, like whether someone has said that they're showing something to the child, or whether someone says, I don't know how this works, let's figure out how this works. And we see this also in the other really striking way that children learn, and that's through play, through doing what one might think of as scientific experiments, except that when 2-year-olds do it, we call it getting into everything. And intuitively, I think for a long time, people have felt that children learn by playing, but we haven't actually had very much good evidence for that until very recently. And there's a good reason for that, which is if you want a particular outcome, if you want to see whether a child is doing a particular thing, you're always better off just shaping them, teaching them, giving them incentives to do that one single thing. So if you use a particular measure, you're always going to do better if you're not just playing around, if you're actually getting trained to do whatever that particular measure is. But what the science shows is that where play is crucial is, once again, innovating, exploring, considering new possibilities. So even if you look at baby rats, for example, who it turns out like essentially all complex baby organisms play, the difference between the rats who play and the rats who don't play isn't that the rats who don't play, so you can actually, with rats, you can actually do experiments where you keep a group of rats from playing when they're young and you let another group of rats play. And it turns out the difference in the adults isn't that the playful rats can do something that the adult rats, the non-playful rats, can't. It's that the playful rats can deal with new contexts. They're sensitive, they're flexible, they change what they do in the light of different circumstances. They're more sensitive to their environment. And that increasingly is the picture of what play is all about. And in experiments that we've done in our lab and other people have done, we've shown that when children are playing, for example, they're figuring out just the things that a toy can do versus the things that a toy can't do. If they have a toy that presents a causal problem, they're more likely to play with it than a toy where the problem has already been solved or is obvious. And most important, if they're presented with this context of directed teaching where someone says, I'm going to tell you how my toy works, then you don't see them doing this exploration. A lovely study actually done right here in Boston by Elizabeth Bonowitz and Laura Schultz at MIT. They showed the children a new toy that could do lots of different interesting things, 4 different interesting things. Either the experimenter said, here's a toy, that's weird, I don't know how this works, and then accidentally bumped into the toy and made it squeak. So that was the first condition. The experimenter accidentally bumps into the toy, says, it squeaked. Then she just leaves the room. She says, here's my toy, just play. And sure enough, as you might expect from 4-year-olds, the children figure out all the things that the toy can do. Exactly the same experiment. Now the experimenter says, I'm going to show you my toy. I'm going to show you how it works. Squeak. And the children squeak, and then they squeak again, 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 and then they squeak again. And they don't go out and explore the other possibilities, the other things that the toy could do. So the kind of picture that comes both from the evolutionary work and from the empirical developmental work is the thing that's so distinctive about children is this capacity for novelty, for exploration and possibility. And again, in the computer science literature, they have a kind of nice slogan to describe two different kinds of learning. The slogan is exploration versus exploitation. And the picture is that one way that you can learn is you can just make little adjustments to what you already think to try to get to a good enough solution pretty quickly. And that's what we do most of the time when we're grown-ups and we're trying to deal with a new situation. So we just make little adjustments to where we already are and try and find a new solution. Another way that you could try to learn is by bouncing around, trying crazy ideas, going completely out of the box, thinking of things that no one would ever think was a good solution, and trying those kinds of solutions. Now, obviously, the disadvantage of that exploration strategy is that you spend a lot of time on ideas that are completely useless and crazy. And if you hang out with 3-year-olds, their minds a lot of the time are in very strange, crazy, weird spaces. But what that also means is that if there's a solution that's really far away, a really good solution, but not very much like what you're thinking about now, you're more likely to get it with this exploration strategy than with the exploitation strategy. But once again, the cost is somebody has to be taking care of you. Somebody has to be popping termites in your mouth and telling you about all the knowledge and information that the previous generations of humans have accumulated in order for you to be able to do this kind of exploration. So what is it that being a parent as opposed to parenting is all about? What does it do? Why is it important if it isn't this kind of parenting picture where it shapes you to come out to be a particular kind of person? I think that being a parent is something that is important in ways that have tensions and paradoxes built into them. And by the way, it's kind of striking that we don't wive our husbands and we don't child our parents, and even on Facebook, we don't really friend our friends. We think of all those things as being relationships that we put a lot of time and work and energy into, but we don't think of them as taking these other people and turning them into people with a particular kind of outcome. So what is it that parents and other caregivers do? Well, one thing that they do is love their children. And it's rather striking that we have this enormous unconditional commitment to each one of those children before we know anything about what that child is going to be like. If you become a new grandmother, this becomes incredibly vivid because, you don't have any hormonal changes or pregnancy, and, 2 weeks after this new baby is born, you're basically ready to give your life for this baby, not all those other babies, but this particular baby. And you do that in spite of the fact that all parents are different and all children are different. But again, if you're thinking about this general kind of picture of creating an ecosystem, that kind of unconditional commitment to very diverse kinds of human beings and people is absolutely crucial to maintain the possibility of diversity as we face new kinds of challenges. A second thing that we do is we pass on our values to our children. So I'm not at all arguing that we should somehow, leave the children out in the desert to raise themselves. It isn't for human beings just a matter of plunking termites into their mouths and keeping them alive. It's also a matter, because we're cultural beings, of passing on the knowledge and information and values that have been important to us. But we have to do that knowing that the very point is that our children will take that knowledge and values and revise it and reshape it and turn it into something new and unprecedented that we could never have anticipated before. And that's another kind of paradox and tension that's built into being a parent as opposed to parenting. And finally, what we have to do is create a safe environment, a safe, stable place in which all this exploration can happen, knowing that the point of that safe and stable space is to allow children to take risks, allow children to explore, allow children to do things that might get them into trouble. And in a sense, if there isn't a possibility that your children can fail, you haven't succeeded as a parent. Because the whole point of being a parent from this perspective is exactly to create creatures who are autonomous enough that they can do something that's new and risky. And it's not new and risky unless there's a genuine possibility of failure. So the sort of utopian image that comes out of parenting, that if only you did the right things, you could make sure that your child would never fail, that's, I think, both scientifically and even morally not the right way of thinking about what being a parent is all about. So last thing to say, in fact, I think what's happened is, often people ask me, well, okay, that's all very abstract. Can you point to a place where this kind of gardening happens? Because after all, we aren't foragers anymore. We aren't just watching other people take care of children. And I think we actually know a really good place where this happens, and it's actually called a child's garden, namely the old-fashioned idea of a kindergarten. And remember, it was called a kindergarten and not a preschool for good reason. The picture of the people going all the way back to the 1920s and 30s who started early childhood education was exactly to provide this kind of rich, safe space in which children could go out and explore. And if you look at the best early childhood education programs like the Reggio Emilia or some Montessori schools, the child studies centers at places like Harvard and Yale and Berkeley, they provide an excellent model of this kind of caregiving. So one of the things I say is, what do children need? They need mud, livestock, and relatives more than anything else. And actually, for urban children, those things are kind of in short supply a lot of the time. But if you can't get mud, livestock, and relatives, a sandbox and a guinea pig and a good preschool teacher is kind of the next best thing. But of course, what's happening is that instead of taking those models, where preschool teachers, I think, have intuitively seen what the science is telling us, and expanding them so that they're the models for what parents might do if parents are looking for models, or they're the models for how we might educate people further down the road. In fact, what we're doing is just the opposite. So what we're doing is taking this parenting/schooling model, this kind of controlling model, and insisting that the preschools and early childhood education programs that have intuitively done what the science says should adapt to the parenting model, so that early childhood educators are increasingly in this kind of pincer movement with parents who want their kids to go to Harvard on the one hand, and policymakers who want to make sure that their investments in early childhood have accountable, measurable results on the other hand. And both of them, ironically, instead of getting closer to the picture that the science tells us about, are actually pushing us further away from the picture that science tells us about, even in places like early childhood programs where that are one of the best examples we know of how this child's garden could actually take place. So the final moral is that the reason why parents care is so children can explore. We're not shaping our children to have a particular outcome. What we're doing is creating an autonomous next generation. One of the great myths is the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and I think that's a good image of our difficult relationship with our past. So, we look behind us like Orpheus looking at Eurydice slipping away, and we see our parents and our grandparents and our own childhood and our own children slipping away into the past. And if you're a parent, I think you sort of have the opposite of that. We're always watching our children and our grandchildren going off ahead of us, drifting off ahead of us into a future that we're not actually going to reach. That's one of the things that being a caregiver is all about. But I think even though there's something kind of wistful about that image, there's also something very satisfying and reassuring and liberating about it. Because we care for our children can go into the future. let me stop there and ask for some questions.
Dr. Gopnik, that was a tremendous, and I agree with so much of what you said, and it was very enlightening and helpful. You know, when I came to this talk, I hadn't read any of the prior material, so I just was able to take it in fresh. But in hearing the title, you know, against the Manifesto Against Parenting, I was wondering, you know, there is this intensive parenting that parents do, which is sort of not the same as the shaping that you're talking about, although it often could be. Mm-hmm. So we hear so much that parents have to be, like, it is a sort of like the work you're talking about, that parents feel obligated to do that work. Now, you could see that intensive investment, like the middle class or upper middle class educated mother, her child is her project, right, in a way that we never saw in prior generations. And the anthropologist Ruth Mace says it's because there's been this arms race that parents are competing against each other to raise their children, that parents have always, by natural selection, wanted to get their genes into the next generation, but instead of having many children, we now intensively invest in just a small number. Mm-hmm. So the intensive investment is kind of orthogonal to the issue of whether they're shaping, because the intensive investment could be intensively invest to create, to do all the good things that you just talked about. Mm-hmm. But the other part of intensive investment, though, is also the costly signaling that middle class parents often need to do to other parents to gain our place in our community. We have to actually parent in a certain way, otherwise we actually could be ostracized and not find play dates for our child.
Well, that costly signaling which is an idea that comes from evolution, is a nice metaphor that I've actually used myself. I think a lot of contemporary middle-class parenting is like Irish elk antlers. So as you may know, the Irish elk compete about who can have the largest rack of antlers. And what happens is that you end up with these animals that can hardly move because they're staggering under the weight of the antlers. And I think life for a lot of middle-class teenagers and middle-class teenagers' parents has some of that quality, where there's this sense of, there's something crazy about this. You know, my child staying up till 1 a.m. because they have to finish their homework so they can do better than the other child. It's just nuts. But if I don't do it, then that was what I was saying about that. What about that kid next door? Maybe they're going to be doing it. And I think it's important to say that what the science suggests is that, again, to use the metaphor about an ecosystem, I think there's actually a pretty nice analogy to what happens when we have a monoculture in agriculture, for example. So it might seem like the best strategy for a farmer is put more pesticides and more fertilizer and find the strain of potato that's going to give you the biggest potato, and put all this energy into just making that potato into the biggest and best potato that you possibly can. But one of the morals that we've learned is that's not a good strategy, and it's especially not a good strategy when things are likely to change, when things are going to be unexpected. So I think even if you thought, okay, it's just parental investment rather than shaping, I think there's an analogy there that by ignoring your children and neglecting your children, and not neglecting your children, but by letting your children be bored, by doing the things that you would do anyway instead of doing the things that this professional parent person is supposed to do. I think what the science suggests is that's the context in which children are actually learning. And I hope that this is both reassuring and liberating as a message for parents, because what it says is the way that children learn, this observational learning and this learning through play, that happens best when parents are doing the things that are most important to them, when parents are pursuing the work and the activities that they really care about, not when parents are turning themselves into this other person with this parenting profession.
So I'm also a fellow gardener, so I love your title. I was taken by your historical analysis, in that parenting sort of wasn't a profession really until the 70s or 80s. So thinking culturally, I'm wondering, how do you understand what's been happening in America that we're so focused now on controlling and curating our children? Because if we look at the parenting books, there's the French Bringing Up Bébé, which is much more relaxed, where we have tiger moms. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear how you think about that.
Well, I think one of the things that comes out of the science is that these small variations in what parents do that are the focus of the parenting, as far as we can tell, almost always don't make any difference in the long run. And there's a tremendous irony, because there are things that we know do make a tremendous difference in the long run. So having the resources to be able to unconditionally love a child, having the resources to have a rich environment of the sort that you get in a great preschool, that makes an enormous difference, so that children which includes 20% of American children who are growing up in poverty, a number which is larger than any other developed nation and going up instead of going down, we know that putting resources there makes a difference in the long run. We know that better than we do almost anything in social science. But the decision about, do you co-sleep with your children, or do you let them sleep, do you let them cry? There's a whole parenting blog debate about, do your strollers face front or face forward? And literally, parents are saying, if I put my child in the stroller facing the wrong way, what effect is it going to have on him when he's 25? And those kinds of differences, as far as we know, don't make any difference in the long run. So there is something about that. There is something about that particular culture of parenting, that emphasis on these small intentional differences that doesn't, and the emphasis that those small intentional differences are going to have these long-term effects, and that you should evaluate them by their long-term effects. I think that's very much part of the contemporary culture of parenting, which hasn't been true historically and hasn't been true in other cultures. It's very much part of our particular moment and our particular lives. And I do think, if parents could focus on the act of parenting, the relationship of parenting, the moment when they're thriving and their child is thriving. And part of what I want to convey in the book is the fact that every single child learns to be a human adult is one of the most amazing, miraculous things on the planet. And every caregiver gets to both be part of that process and to observe that process. And to be sitting there saying, if the stroller faces front, what will happen 25 years from now, is a terrible waste of time and energy and thought.
Thank you. It strikes me that the parenting culture really only affects a very small subset of parents, and I was very glad to hear you touch on some policy issues. Mm-hmm. You particularly talked about preschool, but it strikes me that we live in a society in general right now in this country that is pushing parents away from any kind of relationship with their children. Parents, I'm thinking of the Baltimore parents who let their 10-year-old walk his little brother to the park and were called in by DCFS. Yeah. I'm thinking of the bus drivers who in this city on Monday had to take their children with them to work because there was no school and they had no other alternatives. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the big policy pictures that are pushing parents out of a relationship with their children.
Yeah. So the whole last section of the book is exactly about this. And I think there's there's some pretty obvious things that we can do, things that every other civilized country does, have parental leave, policies have universal preschool. We again, this is something we know how to do. There's no mystery about how to do this. But I also think there's a deeper kind of conceptual and cultural point, which is that we don't have a good place for caring for anybody in our culture. So we treat everything as if it's either a mode of production or a mode of consumption. And if you treat caregiving, taking care of children that way, either it's a very badly paid job or a very expensive luxury. And I think that is very much the way that we treat caregiving. And that doesn't just apply to our relationship to children, it applies to our relationships to the elderly, for example. It applies to our relationships to people with disabilities. We treat all of our relationships as if they have to have this work model. And I think that's part of the reason the adoption of the work model into being a parent is just one example of the idea that everything that we do should be thought of as goal-directed work. Now, on the other hand, and I've had this argument sometimes, people say, well, look, childcare should be seen as valuable work. It should be seen as valuable caring, I think, not necessarily valuable work. We should be able to say that there are things that are valuable, which means they need resources, they need money, they need taxes, they need the rest of us to contribute without necessarily thinking of them as being a work product that's going to have particular outcomes that we can put on a balance sheet. And I talk at some length about that. I think you can make a very similar argument about play. So perhaps because America's always been a highly puritanical culture, we have this tendency to think that play only really counts if it's really work in disguise. And that's not just true about children's play, it's true about art and science and sport and all the ways that we play as adults. I do think that Americans have this knack for taking things that are sort of spontaneous joys in other cultures and turning them into strenuous work projects. So, in other places they eat spaghetti and tomatoes. We have a Mediterranean diet. In other places they take a nice after-dinner walk. We go for hikes. There's this sort of strong puritanical streak that I think comes out a lot in thinking about play. And play is another example where we should be supporting the arts, not because the arts are going to make you better at math or they're going to improve your GDP. We should be supporting them because play is part of what we are as human beings, and we need to support that. And of course, one of the other paradoxes is in the long run, caring for children, allowing play, allowing possibility from an evolutionary perspective and even from just a non-evolutionary perspective, has real benefits. It has real payoffs in terms of being able to allow innovation and creativity. The paradox is it's one of those things where not having a goal in the short run is exactly the thing that you need to be able to accomplish really important overarching goals in the long run. And it doesn't help if you turn the short run into something that's goal-directed.
Hi, Alison. Thank you very much for the amazing talk at the book. So my question is also probably a cultural issue. I don't know how common is it in US for grandparents, let grandparents take care of kids. But in China, as far as I know, it's pretty common that the grandparents spend most of the time with the baby from birth to school age, maybe. So maybe let's call it grandparenting. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your opinion as to grandparenting compared to parenting.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, my short opinion is that my one piece of advice, and it's hard to resist people asking you for advice when you're talking about parents, my one piece of advice to people is skip the children, go straight to the grandchildren. The grandchildren are dessert, right? They're really, really, really the good part. I think when you actually look at human culture, and the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes has made this point really vividly, the combination of having parents and grandparents and cousins and alloparents all involved in caregiving, I think we have some quite good evidence that children are very, very well adapted to learn in that kind of situation with lots of different models. And if you think about it, in our past, grandparents were the source of culture. I mean, we were the ones who could tell you what had happened one or two generations in the past. And we don't know very much about this from a research perspective, but my intuition is just as fathers and mothers often are providing different kinds of information to children, grandparents are providing a different kind of interaction. And I think the really important thing is I think we do have evidence that children who grow up with a lot of different models of how the world can be, how you can behave, what you can do, what culture and values are like, are more likely to grow up being flexible, just like children who hear more than one language are more likely to grow up being able to deal with more languages when they become adults. So I am all in favor of thinking that grandparents have a really crucial role to play. And again, I think from a policy perspective, one of the real dilemmas that we have is the disappearance of grandparents. And we really need to find some way, there are some programs that do this, so that older people who naturally thrive with caregiving for babies and children, and parents who are desperate to get extra help with their parents and children could be put together in the way that grandparents and children were in the past.
Yeah, thank you very much. You touched on this a minute ago about our society being extremely goal-driven. Mm-hmm. If it's not productive, we basically don't value it very highly. And I was just wondering if I'm sure you, in your book, you acknowledge the fact that the 70s, 80s, and 90s were a time when our society became far more goal-oriented, and it became far less playful for adults. And I think adults need to play more, be allowed to play. And there's a feeling that's been growing since the 70s that everything is very, very serious. And parents feel that, and they want to seriously raise their kids, but I think the very opposite is what's necessary. We as adults need to be able to fail, even fail big time, and it takes a village, but basically most of us don't even have friends anymore.
Yeah.
So I'm suggesting that what you said about children, I absolutely agree with, but it's true of our entire culture, I think, and I wonder if you agree.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one doesn't want to be absurdly, you know, nostalgic or sentimental. Life in a forager culture was, well, maybe it was sort of a picnic, but it wasn't. So you couldn't quite say it was no picnic. It was actually a picnic all the time. But there were lots of costs and problems of being a forager, and anyway, we couldn't do it now. But I do think that this tendency to devalue care and devalue play and devalue exploration is something that we've seen. Now, interestingly, just most recently, well, and I should say I'm a little ambivalent about this. Again, if you look in the Valley, right? If you look at the people who are doing innovative work, and you look at an industry which has really shifted from an industry that really needed a lot of goal-directed and often, you know, boring, repetitive work to a kind of post-industrial world where what we need are the things that the robots can't do. We need innovation and creativity. It's rather striking that the culture of a lot of those places at least explicitly includes a big element of play. So, you know, at Pixar they have playrooms, and at Google you see they have a policy of giving people a day or a half day where they can just look to a problem that they want to solve themselves. I'm ambivalent because I think we should value those things independently of whether they're going to end up helping in a post-industrial age, but it's at least worth pointing out that some of that culture might shift as we move to a world in which those capacities are even greater. And again, it's a deep irony that at a time when those capacities for diversity and creativity and innovation are more and more valued and more important, both in the way that we take care of our children and in the way that we have our schools, we're actually operating in ways that scientifically completely weigh against those values. And that seems to be a sort of bitter irony of the way that we're raising our children at the moment.
Those enlightened work environments seem to make up for the lack of the Boulding alone talks about.
Yeah.
That, you know, they seem to recognize that there's a need for that, and they sort of fill it in with.
I mean, again, I think the big challenge is, can we create new institutions that will serve the function of villages in the past? And I actually, as I say, I actually am not totally pessimistic about this. If you look at something like great early childhood programs, they not only are good for the children, but they can create a community among parents. If you look at children's museums, that's one of my favorite examples, which are also things that have really flourished in the last 15 years. That's an example of an environment that didn't exist before, where a bunch of parents can come, they can be sitting on the bench and talking, their children can be running around and exploring the way we used to in the streets or in the park before we got scared about streets and parks. So I think that it should be possible to do, but I think we at least have to recognize that that's what we need, not more schools and younger schools.
Thank you. My question is, I wondered if there has been any study that has been done to compare, well, I would say an American upbringing. I'm thinking of the upper class English, where many of the children are sent away to boarding schools at third grade or fifth grade, and everything is programmed, and there's not a lot of creativity. There's a lot of rules, and maybe the child comes home Christmas, Easter, 3 times a year, sees the parents for a long weekend or something. How does that child that comes out of that environment that has spent 12 years away from the home and the parents and parenting, on-hands parenting, stack up against the child that has had a lot of interaction with parenting. Has there been any studies that have compared that?
Yeah.
My thought would be that maybe some of those children we know from history have come out and have wonderful educations and are very bright, but maybe not so personal or artistic or something, and I wondered if you had seen any studies to compare.
I mean, the trouble is that these things are always, as we scientists say, confounded. So whenever, if you're comparing, in the contemporary context, you're comparing, say, a kid in a Montessori school in Marin County and a kid in a very directive KIPP school in inner city Chicago, there's so many other things that are going to be different about those children's lives, or the life of an English upper class child and an American middle class child, that it's very hard scientifically to pick out what are actually the relevant causal variables. We do know, as I said before, that very simple interventions like providing nurses who can consult with parents after their children are born, or providing high quality creative preschool early on. We do know that those have, we have intervention studies that show that those have really striking long-term effects up to 30 or 40 years. So we do have some studies that suggest that the really basic things about, are you looked after, do you have resources, are you loved, are you in that environment, we do have a lot of evidence for that. But again, I mean, an important thing to say is, if this picture about diversity and creativity and possibility culturally is right, one thing that you'd predict is that you'd end up with an incredibly wide variety of different ways of having and rearing children in different cultures, and that would constantly be transforming and changing. So the fact that we've ended up with this particular model now, that's sort of part of this exploration process of the space of what do we do and what kinds of outcomes do we have. And part of our reaction should be, well, that one doesn't seem to be doing so well, and at least in terms of children thriving, let's try something different. It's, I should say, an interesting example, people were talking about this before, is in China. I had a conversation at one point with a very determined woman who was a sub-minister of education in China. And she said, well, look, we have this terrible problem. We're educating our children. They're very smart, but they're not doing the kind of creative things that we want in America. So could you tell us, what could we do with our whatever it is? I have 1 million children, and I can determine their curriculum. What should we do with all 1 million of those children that will make them grow up to be creative and innovative? And I think there's some of that. You kind of hear things that it was sort of, well, anything that you do in the same curriculum for 1 million children is not going to be the right thing to make them be creative and innovative. So there's, again, the book talks about these basic paradoxes of caregiving, and one of the paradoxes is that in order to be able to have possibilities, you have to sort of give up some of your ideas about control.
Hi, this is great stuff, a really important conversation. I have read, I haven't done extensive research myself, but I have read that one of the major benefits of play is that it helps develop empathy, helps children to develop empathy. You didn't mention that specifically, at least I didn't hear it. You were focusing more on innovation and creativity, also important things. Do you have anything you want to say about what I just meant, the development of empathy?
Yeah, so one of the things that I talk about in the book, one of the places that, one of the areas that I actually have worked on myself for almost 30 years, and it's been one of the really exciting developments in developmental psychology, is what's called theory of mind, which means understanding what's going on in other people's minds. And that turns out to be a really deep, important thing that we learn as children, probably the most important thing that we learn as children. We think about, reading and writing and arithmetic. Figuring out psychology, figuring out what's going on in other people's minds is unbelievably important. And we know more and more about how that ability to understand other people develops. And one of the few pretty clear results in the study of play is that imaginative play, like having imaginary companions or pretending, seems to be it's only correlational, but it seems to be strikingly correlated with being good at figuring out what's going on in someone else's mind. And in this book, and also in The Philosophical Baby, I talk at some length about why that might be the case. We've found that children who are pretending more are better at imagining alternatives. And that's important for everything, but it's especially important for understanding other people, being able to imagine what their lives are like. And I think if you, again, to go back to this point about art and science, one of the great benefits of theater, for example, is that, or novels, is that in that fictional setting we can say, what's it like to be this person? If I were this person, how would I feel? What would I do? And I think there's quite a bit of evidence for a connection between pretend in children, fiction in adults, and our ability to understand what's going on in other people's minds and take their perspectives.
Well, I just want to thank Professor Gopnik for a brilliant talk.
I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature, and I'm interested in how human nature came about by natural selection. I'm particularly interested in the nature of human children, and most particularly in that aspect of children's nature that leads them to acquire the culture into which they're born. In other words, which leads them to be educated. You know, in our culture today, when we think of education, we think of schools, but education has been around for longer than we have been human beings, because education is cultural transmission. We've been transmitting culture for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, maybe a couple of million years. Archaeologists debate about it. But long, long, long before there was anything like school, long, long, long before there was any notion that it was adults' responsibility to educate children. That's a new idea. Throughout most of human history, children educated themselves. Now, we might think of that as surprising. How can children educate themselves? But think of little kids. Think of kids before we ever put them in school. Think of how much they learn before they ever start school. I mean, today, we're so uptight about it that we try to teach even little kids, but that's brand new. Nobody, when I was growing up, tried to teach little kids. But we learned our language, we learned to run and jump and climb, we learned to ask questions, we learned an incredible amount about the world around us with nobody teaching us. It doesn't mean that they didn't help us learn. They answered our questions, they were there, they were models. We learned our language because the language is spoken around us. But children are born to learn. That drive to learn doesn't stop when children turn 5 or 6. We shut it off.